Hi, it's Anthony Birnbaum from the Pear Tree Collection. I just wanted to give you a brief, slightly shorter version of the presentation that I gave to the Silver Society on the 28th of January regarding arts and crafts buckles, their origins and their variety. To whet your appetite, I hope you can see on this very front cover sheet just four really great examples of arts and crafts buckles, particularly the use of enamels, and we will come on to that shortly. I just want to now perhaps talk you through the origins of the design and fashion movement that led to the creation of buckles like this. Firstly, very quickly, buckle definition, just to say we're not talking about shoe buckles, we're talking only about belt buckles, sometimes called nurses' buckles, because of course nurses did use them, but that's a really small subset of what was a much wider fashion with regular use by women and some men of what they called waist buckles. For those that aren't familiar, just to say what do these buckles look like? So I've shown you the back of a Liberty one here. And what you can see, I hope, is that they are in two pieces. You can see the central clasp, which would lock the two together. And then the actual buckle is created, if you like, through stitching in. And that's what people would do. They would individually stitch in each end into an elasticated belt or perhaps some piece of leather to create a belt that would do the job of tightening around the waist or indeed holding up trousers. I'll just say on the right, you can see the front of this particular buckle. And one of the things to note is that with enamels, often enamels were on copper, you couldn't assay silver that had soldered copper, and therefore often part of the design of the buckles had to require that enamels could be slotted into the silver. So we'll come on to that. So this is something I wrote in 2018 on my website. Perhaps just read it very quickly, but essentially it was a call to arms, asking people to become buckle collectors. I did that partly because I found myself as a dealer buying lots of buckles because I loved them, hadn't sold many, and so I had this call to arms. And I'm pleased to say some people took me up on that and started buying buckles, which afforded me the opportunity to help one particular collector in particular buy, sell, build a fantastic collection of buckles, which has informed the knowledge that's in this presentation. And so just to introduce that, so really the belt buckle re-emerged in 1880. It hadn't been current as a fashion item or indeed a useful tool for holding up your trousers or indeed thinning your waist as a woman for centuries, I believe. So there was no really Georgian belt buckles or Victorian belt buckles until around 1880. It came from a continental influence and it coincided with the growth of the arts and crafts movement, which led to this explosion of fashion design, which we're going to talk about further. And just to say, post 1914, and not really because of the First World War, it was a fashion that went out of current, lost its currency completely. And so, what are the key points from that? Well, fashion was brief. The arts and crafts movement coincided with it, so it was very impactful on the arts and crafts movement. And what you'll see, as you've seen from that front cover, is enameling as much as silversmithing was a key facet of the design movement. In terms of the time frame of buckles, how can I be so confident about when was the design phase or the fashion phase? And this is a graph showing the numbers of buckles at auction by assay date since records began, and the records being the invaluable database. And what you can see, and there are inaccuracies in the numbers for sure, but in terms of shape of graph, that's very accurate. And what you can see is there are almost none, indeed none prior to 1883, and really none after 1914. And notwithstanding a few dips, which I'm not sure are meaningful, you can see a classic curve, which peaking around 1902 from around 1895 to 1910. And that is the period of the arts and crafts movement. It's the period of the fashion of the belt buckle. So when I say the period of the arts and crafts movement, the period of an explosion in metalwork and jewelry in the arts and crafts period. And so where did it start for Britain? Well, it came over from continental Europe, as I've said. And in terms of looking at when it landed in Britain, this is the first on the left. You can see an extract from the first newspaper article I could find on it from a reasonably well-read newspaper called the Western Daily Press, and you can see it's talking about the fashion in France and what was this new waistband fashion often in blue steel, as it says, polished steel, narcosite, Louis XIV style with enamel and turquoise. So pretty traditional, you can imagine those buckles, and pretty classical. And then on the right, when does it really land in Britain physically? This is very interesting because this is a picture of Mrs. Luke Ionides, a bit of a trend and fashion setter of her day. She has this glorious picture painted. And what does she choose to show how fashionable she is? Besides the red dress, a tight waistband with a buckle. And the buckle is also in the V&A, as is the picture. And one of the things that's interesting or curious about the buckle is that it was, the V&A believe, I'll say handmade or made from some other item, from some kind of strap work. That is to say, I think you can assume that in 1882, as my analysis showed, Mrs. Ionides couldn't walk out and just buy a buckle in a shop. She had to make and fashion one. And that really was the start of the movement, shall we say, in the UK. So what do you see in the UK initially? Well, I'll say from 1886 to 94, that's the dates of these buckles. You see quite, I'll say, subjectively boring buckles. They're cast sometimes, which is interesting. They're cast for strength, and they're a good gauge of silver. They are, in design terms, interesting but not amazing. They are broadly classical, perhaps with a continental and Dutch theme, and no more. You don't tend to see enamels. You don't tend to see any particularly radical design styles. And were that to have remained the main style of buckles in the period, I wouldn't be presenting to you today. But of course, what we know is you get much more exciting and interesting buckles through the arts and crafts movement. And so why is that? Well, I think, as I've said, it's an overlapping period. It was always going to happen. But I think there are two or three other key points. The first is Alexander Fisher, a really important influence on everyone in the arts and crafts movement at this time, did in 1896 a pretty seminal piece, a Wagner girdle, not quite a belt buckle, but close enough, that very influential. And then in 1898, perhaps both reflecting but also causing the fashion uptake, the Studio magazine did a competition to design a belt buckle. And of course, that was reflective, I think, of the era, but also introduced perhaps hundreds of people to practice designing buckles and give it a go. And obviously, that popularized it amongst the movement of designer silversmiths. And finally, you do see a lot of women silversmiths or women designers of metalwork at this time, and clearly they were perhaps for themselves or near patrons interested in making buckles, and you perhaps see a disproportionate number of women making buckles. So again, why do I say that? Well, I've looked at something called the Arts and Crafts Exhibition Society. That was the society for exhibiting annually, not annually, excuse me, biannually or triannually, all the major arts and crafts pieces of the great designers. And this is a count of the buckles. And what you see is in that exhibition, so pre-1896, no buckles, post-1916, no buckles. So that's inconsistent with the fashion, as we've talked about. And what you can also see is, I would say, a disproportionate number in the dark blue there are made by women. And so obviously that was part of its popularity. So coming on to the first genesis, shall we say, of an arts and crafts buckle. This is actually in steel, not silver, and this is the Alexander Fisher Wagner girdle. It's called Wagner girdle because the enamels depict scenes from Wagner's operas, and I'll say classical German Norse mythology. And the design is also in that style. And really, when you want to think about an arts and crafts design buckle or belt buckle, this is it. It's got the enamels, it's got the imagery, it's got the historicism, and it's actually got an element of Norse and Celtic design that was so popular through Archibald Knox for Liberty. And it's a magnificent piece, as you can see. And these are some of the details. Other points I'd just draw out in terms of the way it's made. It's also made in a way that many of them were made. That is to say, the enamel is essentially stapled, riveted between two sheets of silver to hold it in place. Again, you can't use solder. That would blow the glass enamel. And it would also, not in this case, but if it was silver, it would also limit the ability to assay the piece. So that's the Wagner girdle, and this is a picture of it in its full glory, published in the Studio. Again, that means it was seen by almost everybody that mattered in the world of design. So this would have been a very striking piece, and in fact, it featured twice in the Studio over a 2-year period, such was its significance. This is then the Studio design competition for a buckle. And you can see they produced three buckles here, not actually the winners, mysteriously, but they three entrants. And again, in the top one, certainly you can see a touch of the Norse influence, I think, probably borrowing from Fisher. And in all three, you get a sense that they would have been enameled. I think that's clearly the coloring that you can see. So all three would have been enameled. And so very much from 1898, you got a real design trend being established through this competition. And then you move to Liberty. Of course, you move to the kind of heart of the movement, and who was at the heart of the movement but Liberty and Knox. When I say the movement, the design movement, rather than necessarily the arts and crafts movement. But Liberty were there very much commercially, of course, producing hundreds of buckle designs. And this is a page, give or take, of all of Knox's early buckle designs. You can see some really great buckles there. So this is about 1899. And then, excuse me, then you've got in the same catalogue, so again 1899, you've got Oliver Baker, the other early major designer for Liberty, and you can see his style of buckles slightly different. In the case of Knox, no enamels yet. In the case of Baker, he started to use stones, often turquoise and opal, jelly opals. But what you quickly saw, and this is now images of real buckles, of course, by Liberty, you start to see enamel coming in. So on the left, you've got the jelly opals and turquoise of Baker in quite heavy gauge buckles. You've then got that more modernist design style of Knox, and you can see a slightly later buckle at the bottom there with the enamel. Going forward to about 1904, Jessie King comes in as one of Liberty's top designers, and she did, I think, 4 or 5 really great buckle designs, of which 2 are illustrated. So these are classics of their genre, and partly why now I am so interested in this area. And then just picking out some others, excuse me, what you have, what you have is a number of the other key workshops starting to design buckles. So bear with me here and I'll come back to them. You have so you have Nelson and Edith Dawson did this magnificent buckle that was named the Paradise Buckle, I think named contemporaneously today, not at the time, but it shows birds of paradise perhaps in a forest or a wood, jungle even, set in silver. So again, the silver is not amazing, but the enamels are, and that was part of the appeal of this genre. And then you see Ramsden and Carr. You can see again two of the great silversmiths of the movement. Classic Ramsden and Carr, not always, but they seem to like 3-piece buckles. So coming back, rather than having a simple 2-hook system, you would have a central piece and then the hooks coming from that, and then 2 pieces on the right. That's Alwyn Carr alone. But again, you see the use of enamels and repoussé silver, and again sheet silver, where you've sandwiched the enamels between 2 sheets that are riveted. And then this is just a selection of some of my favorite buckles by some other great designers of the era. So on the left, you've got Joseph Hodel, mixed metal, Bromsgrove Guild. This is around 1905. You've got this amazing large buckle by Ernestine Mills. Not great silversmithing. I'm not sure she was a great silversmith, but truly great enamels. This piece, I think, is about 10 centimeters, maybe more across. Very substantial piece, really remarkable thing. And then on the right, also remarkable and slightly bizarre, you've got a duck or goose sitting on what I would say is inspired from an ancient shield. You've got a buckle in 3 dimensions by Henry Wilson. And the slightly strange thing about that is, of course, when the buckle is sitting vertically, the duck is sort of falling off. But it is unequivocally a buckle originally, and not something that's been adapted since. So those are the kinds of examples of the really best buckles you can buy, and why I talk about them being mini sculptures. And that's really all I wanted to cover. I kept it brief. I'm just going to reinforce what I've said with this conclusion, which is to say that the re-emergence of the buckle was around 1870 in continental Europe, came to Britain from about 1883. By about 1895, the arts and crafts movement adopted it as something they wanted to produce, and you see Fisher and many other, including women designers, silversmiths, start to do a lot of buckles, and you get this golden era of 3-dimensional buckles, wonderful design, lots of enamels and stones, and then it rapidly dies out. So that's really all I had to say. Just a couple of things for those, further things for those who want to really follow up on this in terms of sources. I'm not the first to look into this area. The Kreuzer collection was built by a couple, I'll say well before my time in terms of my interest in collecting in this area. And they put together the most fabulous collection of buckles, which then became the most fabulous book on buckles. And that has very much informed what I've said today. And that collection was then given to the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. More recently, John L. Davis, who is someone I do know much more, a collector of my era, and that's someone I've helped build their collection. And that produced a book called British Silver Belt Buckles, to which I did the introduction, and some of, if not all of the research I've talked about today went into that introduction. And then so you can see some of this material on my website clearly, and then the V&A Museum website's an invaluable tool as well. So that's really it. Thank you very much. I hope you've been slightly inspired now about the humble buckle. Thank you. Thanks very much.